As has become customary at Queen's, it is appropriate on occasions such as this one, I'll begin by noting that the university is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories. And it's important that we remain mindful of this. And second, I will acknowledge the late Bernice Nugent, who is an alumna of the Queen's History Department, and who, of course, generously endowed our lecture series, and we remain grateful to her. And now, to the event at hand, and I'm pleased to introduce our faculty lecturer for 2019. He is Professor Tony Delia. At least since I have been at Queen's, I think this is the first time we've had a repeat performer in the annual faculty lecturer. And it is a deserved distinction because Tony Delia is, without question, one of our most highly decorated faculty members, one of our best published and one of our most distinguished faculty members. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Tony because he is an old personal friend of mine. And as many of you know, we were graduate school associates. And I was trying to remember as I was writing up these comments where I first met Tony Delia in the early 1990s. And I can assure you that it was not on the mats of a Brazilian jiu-jitsu. It was probably in a seminar or a Latin reading group, but it was possibly at a certain Irish pub in Central Square in Cambridge. Regardless, Tony Delia is without question one of the leading historians of the Renaissance working in North America today. He earned his BA and his MA at Trinity College Dublin and his PhD from Harvard. By the time he had arrived at Harvard, he was extremely adept at Greek and Latin, having studied both languages intensively in Rome for many years. Tony is one of the best Latinists you're ever going to meet. And he learned this language, interestingly, from Father Reginald Foster, who, if you're interested in Father Reginald Foster, who was the Latinist at the Vatican for many years, Tony will be happy to tell you all about his fascinating figure. So Tony arrived at Queen's in 2000 and has been a mainstay of the program in European history ever since. He's a prodigious researcher and writer. He has published numerous articles in major venues. He's co-edited a collective volume. He has translated and edited a volume of Plato's Lives of the Popes. And he has, most importantly, authored 3 monographs. In 2004, The Renaissance of Marriage in 15th Century Italy, from Harvard University Press. In 2009, Sudden Terror, Plot to Murder the Pope in Renaissance Rome. And just in 2016, Pagan Virtue and Christian World, Mondo Malatesta, the Italian Renaissance. So he ranges extremely widely. The field of Renaissance studies is sort of bifurcated between humanists who are very skilled in language and in texts, and social and political historians who aren't often very skilled in Latin. And there's a great gulf, a surprisingly large gulf between these two sides of the field, and sometimes a surprising antipathy. And it is Tony's hallmark, I always thought, and many others, that he bridges this divide. He brings consummate technical skill in languages and texts, together with a wide range of interest in social, political, and cultural history. This is evident, for instance, in his first book, where he mastered a largely neglected rhetorical genre, Latin wedding orations, many hundreds of them, in fact, in manuscript, composed during the Italian Renaissance, but he also offered a kind of broader reading of humanists as a cohort responding to the evolving institution of marriage. So the humanist meets the social historian in this book, and indeed in all of Tony's books. His latest book, for instance, which is being very widely and favorably reviewed, is a fascinating account of the extraordinary Prince Mercenaries' Mondo Malatesta of Rimini. And here we get a gripping detail of Malatesta's military and political career, but also first-rate intellectual and cultural history. For instance, of Malatesta's bizarre decision to retrofit the Cathedral of Rimini with pagan iconography and so forth, or of the histories produced by humanists at Malatesta's court. So in short, Tony Delia is that rare historian of the Renaissance who's equally at home with humanist texts as he is with social, political, and cultural history. He knows the texts of classical antiquity as well as the Neo-Latin literature of the Renaissance equally well, or teaches the classes. We are, I suspect, about to get more evidence of his capacity to range widely in tonight's talk, which is entitled The Return of the Gladiators, Violent Sport and Spectacle in Renaissance Italy. Without further ado, thank you.
that's too much. I'm not used to using a microphone, but I think I have to because they're recording this. So let me know if you can everyone hear me all right? I think so. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Wonderful. So my research focuses on how greater knowledge about classical antiquity affected life in Renaissance Italy, a period roughly between 1300 and 1600. My first book, The Renaissance of Marriage, explored classical ideas about marriage, women, and sexual pleasure in the new popular genre of wedding orations. This in turn changed gender ideals, especially in Italian courts. Another book, A Sudden Terror, The Plot to Murder the Pope in Renaissance Rome, similarly studied the prevalence of ancient Roman republican ideas in papal politics, imitations of ancient homoerotic poetry, and pagan philosophical approaches to pain and suffering. My most recent book, Pagan Virtue in a Christian World, traced pagan religious ideas and pagan notions of virtue, especially the revival of a Greek athletic idea in Renaissance Italy. My current research focuses on violent sport and spectacles, how Italian Renaissance intellectuals responded to the violent games that were such a large part of Roman classical antiquity. Ancient Romans delighted in watching enslaved gladiators and exotic animals tear each other apart, fighting, spilling blood, and dying for the pleasure of the masses. Sadistic violence was institutionalized entertainment. Gladiator fights and large animal hunts as entertainment continued to a certain extent in medieval tournaments. But the full extent of the violent spectacles in ancient Rome only became clear in the 14th and 15th centuries, when scholars recovered the ancient writers on the Roman games and recognized the original purpose of the Colosseum. For my talk this evening, I will focus on 4 themes of the Renaissance reception of the Roman games: Christian moral outrage, the Colosseum and classical sources on the games in the Renaissance, theater, mock battles, and arena poetry, the ancient games in Renaissance Rome and Florence. In 14th century Italy, the poet, scholar, and humanist Petrarch dedicated his life to recovering classical antiquity. He modeled his own Latin style on Cicero and Virgil, and hunted for manuscripts of classical texts in monastic libraries. Petrarch and his followers idealized classical Rome. All history, Petrarch wrote, is the history of Rome. Petrarch's love for Roman antiquity, however, had its limits, as we shall see. His role model was St. Augustine. Augustine witnessed the end of the Roman Empire and laid the foundation for Christian theology. In his autobiography, The Confessions, Augustine described his difficult conversion from paganism and classical philosophy to Christianity. Like Augustine, Petrarch wrestled with conflict between his Christian religion and his love for the culture of pagan antiquity. Petrarch said that he always carried the Confessions with him wherever he went, and his writings are often in dialogue with Augustine. In Book 6 of the Confessions, Augustine recounts a story about Alypius, his beloved lifelong friend. In Carthage, Augustine managed to persuade Alypius to abandon his obsession for chariot racing. But later in Rome, Augustine writes, Alypius's friends drag him to see gladiator games in the Colosseum. He unwillingly goes and tries to be strong, but is overcome. Augustine writes, Alypius closed the gates of his eyes and kept his mind from turning to such great evils. Would that he had blocked his ears, for when one fighter fell and a huge cry from the crowd violently jolted him, Alypius was overcome with curiosity and opened his eyes, ready to despise and overcome whatever it was. But he was struck by a deeper wound in his soul, the one in the body which he longed to see, and fell more miserably than the one over whose fall the people had cried out. As soon as he saw that blood, he drank dry a savagery. He did not turn away, but fixed his eyes and unknowingly swallowed up the Furies themselves. He became drunk on bloodthirsty pleasure. He was no longer the man he had been when he had arrived, but now a member of the crowd. The story is an example of pride and the dangers of curiosity. Although sight is acknowledged to be the sense most vulnerable to temptation, it is the sound of the crowd's exultant cheer that makes Alypius open his eyes. The sight of the bleeding, dying gladiator triggers bloodlust. Augustine's moral lesson is clear. Witnessing violence affects the soul and changes the human person. In fact, the damage to the soul in seeing such violence is far greater, he argues, than the actual wound to the body of the fallen gladiator. 1,000 years later, Petrarch recalled the story of Alypius' experience in the Colosseum when he witnessed a shockingly similar violent spectacle in 14th century Naples. Petrarch was obsessed with antiquity, but did not understand classical sport and had no tolerance for the gratuitous violence of the Roman arena games. In Naples, Petrarch writes, "A night journey is no different than walking in the thickest forests. It is full of dangers because of armed noble youths controlling the roads." But Petrarch finds this violence much less shocking when compared to what the Neapolitan nobles considered entertainments. Why is it strange if they dare to do something more shameless in the shadow of the night with no witnesses, when in broad daylight, as kings and the people watch, that infamous gladiator game is celebrated in an Italian city with more than barbaric savagery, where human blood is spilled like sheep's, and often to rows of applauding madmen, unfortunate sons are murdered right under the eyes of their miserable parents. And it is the greatest infamy to accept a sword to the throat too hesitatingly, as if one were fighting for the Republic or the rewards of eternal life. What Petrarch witnessed, of course, was no ancient spectacle, but a tournament involving noble knights, not outcast gladiators. But these tournaments could be just as bloody. In antiquity, both Cicero and Seneca had praised the gladiator's unflinching acceptance of death. What gladiator, Cicero asks, after he has fallen and been ordered to accept the sword, withdraws his neck? But Petrarch finds no virtue in dying gladiators. In his later dialogues, Petrarch condemns both theater and gladiator games. The one, he says, excites lust, and the other he calls a school of cruelty. The Romans, he says, gave to us nothing more reprehensible, more lastingly hideous than these spectacles. Petrarch describes his experience at the tournament in Naples. The queen and prince were present, the nobles and the army, and all the rabble had flooded in. Intrigued by such a great gathering, I focused my eyes as if to see something sublime. When suddenly, as if something joyous had happened, an indescribable applause reached the heavens. I looked around and saw a most handsome youth, stabbed with the sharp point of a sword and lying at my feet. I was astounded and shuddered over my whole body. That's the obsticuły top of the fourth. Like Alypius, Petrarch passively attends the games. After describing a socially diverse audience, including the queen and the prince, Petrarch expresses curiosity and an expectation of something sublime. This is different from Augustine. Alypius knew what was coming and closed his eyes to avoid it. But in both accounts, it is sound that betrays their virtuous non-compliance. The cry from the crowd forces Alypius to open his eyes, and applause makes Petrarch turn his attention to the violent spectacle. Both have extremely physical reactions to a man's slaughter. But whereas Alypius is instantly hooked, Petrarch is shocked, and his whole body shudders. Augustine furthermore makes no reference to the fallen gladiator, who would have been a social outcast and slave. But Petrarch's disgust is directly linked to the handsome youth stabbed and lying at his feet. It is the waste of killing a young, healthy nobleman, a knight. Petrarch had the opposite reaction to Alypius. I spurred my horse and fled from this hideous infernal spectaculum, repeatedly reproaching my companion's deceit, the savagery of the spectators, and the insanity of the games. The license to commit crimes now has the name of dignity and liberty. Petrarch's reaction is pure disgust. It was partially shaped by Augustine. The problem for Augustine was not so much the suffering and murder of the gladiators, but the pleasure that the audience takes in seeing others suffer. The Roman games, Petrarch declares, taught many savagery, but were by nature mild. The human mind is prone to vice. It should not be urged on, but reined in. If left to itself, it will fare badly. If pushed, it will crash headfirst. Petrarch calls the ancient games a plague, and sees their revival in the bloody tournament of his own day a tragedy. Other intellectuals after Petrarch took a more antiquarian approach to the Roman games. In the early 15th century, Poggio Bracciolini and Flavio Biondo tried to reconstruct the topography of ancient Rome, and in doing so, rediscovered the original purpose of the Colosseum. In the Middle Ages, the Colosseum served as a quarry for building materials and was continually looted. Its stone was melted down for lime. Even into the Renaissance, there was constant smoke churning out of the lime kilns inside the Colosseum. Despite its neglect, medieval pilgrims still visited the Colosseum, but its original purpose as an amphitheater was unknown. Medieval guidebooks described the ruin as a temple of the sun, with a gilded bronze dome and a giant statue of Apollo in the center. The Temple of the Sun designation was generally assumed even after 1332, when an elaborate bullfight was staged in the Colosseum. The chronicler of the 1332 bullfight stresses the grand ceremony. He names the spectators, including all the matrons of Rome. Noble youths wearing classical mottos fought the bulls all at once. 18 young men died, 9 were injured, but only 11 bulls were killed. Unlike ancient gladiators, who were usually expendable slaves or prisoners, here the participants were all upper class. Their full names were recorded, and the deceased were feted and buried with honor. The classical allusions in many of their mottos suggest their imagined, if not informed, connection to ancient Rome. Despite this classicism, however, the original function of the amphitheater as a venue for games appears to have been unknown, and the Colosseum continued to be seen as the Temple of the Sun. Newly available ancient texts contain descriptions of monuments which helped identify the ancient ruins that still dominated medieval Rome, chief among these the Colosseum. After studying ancient authors and the ruins themselves, the papal secretary, Poggio Bracciolini, there's a picture of him right there, concluded that the Colosseum had not been a temple of the sun, but was an amphitheater used to put on games. Poggio's younger colleague in the Vatican, Flavio Biondo, described the ruins in greater detail. Like Petrarch, Biondo was revolted by the bloody spectacles that he read about in the Colosseum. In that large round amphitheater, he writes, not only were incitements to lust and other lewd activities and effeminizing games performed, but examples of the greatest cruelty, as eager men fought losing battles with wild beasts and were exposed to death. Biondo connects Augustine's condemnation of theater as lust-inducing with the bloody combat violence of the Colosseum. But Biondo also cites some ancient justifications for the gladiator games. He quotes Cicero, who said that the games served to condition soldiers to the violence of war. Much of the ancient world, he says, was still to be found in the Roman customs of his time. Biondo, in fact, witnessed a masqueraded mock battle in Piazza Navona in 1457. The church sponsored the event to celebrate the routing of the Turks at the siege of Belgrade in July 1456. Biondo writes that just as the ancient historian Livy had ascribed the origins of the Apollonian Games to a victory celebration, so the Roman festivities were put on to celebrate the salvation of Belgrade. Biondo says that the ancient games are still played in Rome. In 15th century Rome, carnival events focused on two athletic competitions. Jews, prostitutes, old men, hunchbacks, and dwarves were forced to run races down the Via del Corso for coin prizes. And on Monte Testaccio, a hill near Piramide, there were bullfights and games, including a popular one in which a pig was placed inside a barrel and rolled down the hill into awaiting peasants, who were often maimed or killed as they fought over the meat. Popes, cardinals, and princes in Rome, Ferrara, and Florence staged elaborate festivities and competitions that recalled the ancient games. This classical revival was directly related to the new availability and popularity of ancient sources, especially our richest source for the games in the Colosseum, the Latin poet Martial. Martial was a court poet under the Emperor Titus. Titus is most famous for massacring Jews and destroying Jerusalem in 70 CE. His father Vespasian had started work on the Colosseum, and when Titus died in 81, his mad brother Domitian took over. Martial wrote some 36 poems about the inaugural games in 80 CE. He praises Titus and his brother Domitian for sponsoring such a magnificent show, which featured mythological executions, interspecies combats, gladiator fights, and dramatic hunts of exotic beasts. Some of Martial's other poetry was quoted in the Middle Ages, but his poems about the games were either unknown or had no visible impact. This changed in 1361, when Boccaccio found a complete manuscript of Martial in the monastery of Monte Cassino, just south of Rome. These highly descriptive poems were used to reproduce classically inspired spectacles in Renaissance cities. Poets also imitated the Roman poet in their own descriptions of the actual events that took place in late 15th century Italy. Renaissance poetry is thus a rich source for both the revival of ancient sport and the poetry about it. There's some wonderful, some 15th century martial names. In 1473, Princess Eleanor of Aragon parted from Naples on her way to Ferrara to be wed to Ercole d'Este. Her nuptial train stopped in several cities. She was especially feted in Rome, where Cardinal Pietro Riario treated the bride to a 12-hour banquet and various entertainments that included acrobats, dances, and mock battles. Pomponio Leto supplied the classical themes for the entertainments. Pomponio was a famous classical scholar in Rome. He read Latin texts with his followers and studied the ruins of Rome. Pomponio was also a serious scholar of Martial, and several manuscripts of Martial's works with Pomponio's annotations survive. It's neat, you can see some of his annotations on the side here. And that's apparently a portrait of Pomponio by one of his students taking him around Rome. He just kind of jotted it down in the 1470s. In addition to eyewitness descriptions, two poets, Emilio Boccabella and Porcellio, wrote lengthy Latin poems about the banquet and the entertainments. The banquet contained classical themes. There were massive sugar sculptures of Hercules' labors, Perseus, and the chained Andromeda. So even sugar was made into a violent spectacle. One of the meat courses horses came with an actor dressed as Orpheus and singing verses. He was surrounded by 4 peacocks, 2 pheasants, 2 swans, and 2 cranes, cooked, but with their feathers put back on. Larger cooked animals also appeared, as an eyewitness reported. Deer redressed in its skin with horns on its head. A bear dressed in its fur, holding a stick in its mouth. Another deer, a goat, pigs, and boars, and many other animals, all cooked and put back into their skins, and all life-size so that they seemed real. They were carried onto the stage and put around a mountain. The poets stressed the realism of the animals, the massive fake mountain, and the role of Orpheus, whose dulcet tones calmed the savage animals. Eleanor and the audience apparently were astonished. This performance is evocative of an execution staged in the Colosseum in 80 CE. Marshall describes a moving fake mountain scene. A man dressed as Orpheus, surrounded by all kinds of beasts, is mauled to death by a bear. Marshall's account is inverted in the Renaissance banquet, as the mauling bear lies below Orpheus, cooked and refurred with a stick in its mouth, along with Orpheus's other animals, also cooked with their skins sewn back on. They look alive but are dead and ready to be eaten. Cardinal Riario built a large theater for Eleanor's visit. The temporary structure was so elaborate that the bride herself described it in some detail. The poet Boccabella compares it to ancient arenas, including the Colosseum. But here, the poet says, glory comes obtained from no blood, but right and gentle play. For gladiators were not allowed to engage with drawn swords and in the slaughter of various wild beasts, nor was it pleasing to see contests of human life, but tranquil peace is present, and Bologna mixes contest without the rage of bloody men. The 12-hour banquet included interludes between courses. There was a mock battle of men and centaurs. An actor dressed as Hercules, 5 men and 9 women, performed a dance. Then suddenly a group of centaurs armed with shields and spears attacked. Although it was a choreographed, fake battle, both poets stressed the violent realism. The battle is ferocious, and very many centaur bodies fall to the ground, including my corpora. The audience is astonished. Violence was the focus of the entertainment, even for a wedding celebration. Another mock battle included a female gladiator and a dwarf. Actors and performers came, and a female gladiator was present. Among them there was one dwarf. Here with his fist, with arms and the giant passion of his spirit, he fought huge warriors and flattened their bodies to the ground. This unusual battle is a direct reference to ancient spectacles. Marshall praises Titus for including female gladiators in the inaugural games at the Colosseum. He compares one woman to Hercules for killing a lion. The ancient poet Statius describes a battle between female gladiators dressed as Amazons and the, quote, bold order of dwarves, dealing out wounds and threatening death. Then, in the middle of the fight, giant cranes come down and attack them. You can see this, this is an ancient mosaic with a crane and a dwarf. That's an Amazon. Similar festivities greeted the bride when she arrived in Ferrara. These included gladiator-inspired competitions and hunting shows. Documentary sources describe the classical nature of the events. A poet, Matteo Canale, emphasized that the combat games were exciting but not deadly. He contrasts them with the violence of gladiator combat. There are those who prefer to fight with sharp iron and rouse armed men openly, but the gladiator fights falsely on the dusty arena and falls cut down by an enemy sword elsewhere. Here, men more pleasantly perish by the skill of a wooden sword, right? A wooden sword was used for practice. In describing the slaughter of a wild boar, then a bull, the Renaissance poet makes direct use of Martial's praise for similar events in the Colosseum, and often uses the same images of, for example, the bull throwing something to the stars, or himself getting into the heavens. So far, the Renaissance revival of the Roman games might seem like theater, choreographed play fighting, far from the bloody affairs of the Colosseum. The competition and violent confrontation became much more pronounced in the later 15th century. Classical sport and spectacle was a dominant theme under Pope Alexander VI. The Pope's son, Cesare Borgia, participated in several triumphal parades and gladiator-inspired combat events in Rome. Pope Alexander made Cesare a cardinal at the age of 18, but he had no desire to be a cleric. He preferred debauchery, and probably murdered his older brother so that he could take his place as commander of the papal army. In 1501, the Pope made Cesare Duke of the Romagna, an area in the Adriatic, where petty lords were in open rebellion. Through devious but brilliant means, Cesare subjugated the Romagna. Cesare is one of the stars of Machiavelli's Prince. Machiavelli's Cesare is superhuman in courage, a man of decisive and effective action. He is the embodiment of virtu, a manly man who seizes and controls the goddess Fortuna. As the Pope's son and commander of the papal army, Cesare had enormous power in Rome and was much feared. He acted, some at the time said, like one of the worst emperors. For the carnival of 1500, in his honor, the Romans recreated the triumph of Julius Caesar. With 11 floats, Cesare Borgia led the triumphal parade, riding on a white steed. Cesare was a star performer at the games for his sister, Lucrezia Borgia's wedding in 1502. The Borgia poet, Cantalicchio, wrote a book of Latin poems about the games and festivities. He casts them in classical terms, but emphasizes throughout how the Borgia games were superior to anything put on in ancient Greece or Rome. There were, for example, ancient Olympic-style foot races and wrestling events. In St. Peter's Square, 8 knights defended a wooden castle besieged by 16 soldiers. It lasted for 2 days and was as bloody and deadly as any held in the Colosseum of ancient Rome. Cantalicchio calls the knights gladiators, each fighting for the prize of 200 ducats. All 24 men were from Cesare's army. 8 men were killed. The poet, in fact, praises the violence. Lest you by chance think that this was pretend fighting, life was quite often taken away by death. These battles, believe me, were not put on in vain. They prove the power of Cesare's castles. Other sources also stress the violence. But the poet and the chronicler do not decry the fatalities in the game. They instead boast about it and point to it as proof of how realistic the combat was. The wedding festivities also included several bullfights. The Borgia family was Spanish, and the sources refer to particularly Spanish forms of bullfighting. This seems to have focused more on individuals on foot, rather than the Roman practice of killing bulls en masse from mounted horses with long lances. Instead of having the bullfights in Testaccio on the outskirts of Rome, which was customary, the Borgia held them in St. Peter's Square. This made the events more prominent and meaningful, as the kills happened right in front of the Pope's church. Cesare Borgia and 8 companions rode into St. Peter's Square wearing gold brocade. They showed off their horsemanship with graceful choreography. And then 2 wild and savage bulls were released. After one bull was killed, Cesare got off his horse and struck down the remaining bull. Other bulls were released, and in total 8 bulls and 2 buffaloes were slaughtered. One source, Bernardino Prosperi, delighted in the fatal violence. I won't be silent about the most beautiful part of the game. Among the bulls, a most cruel one turned upon the soldiers. It knocked 2 men down with little damage, but the bull got another man in the side with its horns and threw him higher than he stood. When he landed on the ground, he did not move foot or leg and was believed dead. 3 expensive noble horses were also killed. We could compare this fascination with violence to our own love for the knockout punch. But calling the goring of a man the most beautiful part of the game, el più bello del gioco, shows a very unmodern insensitivity to human life. In contrast, the writer then goes on to lament the death of 3 horses. In his Latin poem about the 1502 games, Cantalicchio compares them to the ancient Venationes, the hunting exhibitions in the Colosseum. But the ancient games, he declares, cannot compare to those of the Borgias. Cesare's native Spain supplied a show of bulls, which no ancient age ever produced. These ferocious bulls, Cantalicchio continues, did not fall by a common death, but perished by a more noble kind of death. The bulls run wild, scaring and attacking everyone. Seeing this, Cantalicchio says, Cesare Borgia could not hide the virtues of his soul. He enters the arena and pierces the side of the bull, which was the greatest source of fear. Laid out by only one blow, the bull is flattened. Cesare then leaves the arena, resplendent on his magnificent horse, as the entire theater applauds his speed. Cesare leaves the safety of his men and confronts the scariest bull. With a single strike, he kills it. Cantalicchio compares Cesare to the famed arena hunter Carpophorus, who stunned the audience at the inaugural games at the Colosseum in 80 CE. Martial extolled him in 3 poems. Carpophorus, Martial declares, speared a lion, a leopard, and even a polar bear. In another event, the hunter fends off a crazed rhinoceros who had just gored a bear. And in the longest poem, Martial asserts that Hercules' 12 labors were nothing compared to Carpophorus' feat of killing 20 animals at one time. Cesare Borgia may have only slaughtered bulls, but he was a noble duke, proudly and freely displaying his virtue, not a slave forced to perform like Carpophorus. A fresh herd of bulls are released into the arena, and the men come out again, this time on foot. Cantalicchio continues his flattering description of Cesare and his men. Their swords and spears, techniques, and right hands were trained to wound in the Spanish manner. Among them, Cesare Borgia came out again, his face covered but recognized nonetheless. For just as Mount Olympus poorly hides itself in Thessaly, so were the arms of Cesare ill-covered. As in the previous battle on horseback, the bulls go wild, but there is one more enraged than the others. The bull rushes everyone, scatters, presses, attacks, and is eager to throw the troops blocking his way into the stars, ad astra. This is a direct reference to Martial's poems about crazed bulls in the Colosseum who throw men and balls to the stars with their horns. But the attack, Cantalicio continues, in the end failed, for Cesare sprung forward with his scimitar unsheathed and attacked the beast, cut off its head, and threw the violent bull to the ground. He then walked out of the arena, a ferocious conqueror with his troops. The poet concludes, whatever Castor and Pollux did in battle as two, you, Cesare Borgia, do alone. Several other sources report Cesare's brave feat. Some scholars have seen this as a threatening gesture to the Roman spectators, just as the Spanish duke easily kills the bull with one stroke. So could Cesare easily put down any challenges to Borgia rule. The feat, however, does call to mind the mad Roman Emperor Commodus's infamous actions in the Roman Colosseum. It was considered scandalous for any free man, let alone the emperor, to perform in the Colosseum. Commodus had a portrait of himself made as Heracles. Wherever he went, attendants carried a lion skin and club before him. Commodus actually fought in the Colosseum as a gladiator and beast hunter. He claimed to have fought 735 or even 1,000 gladiator fights. Commodus forced the senators to attend his games and applaud him as their victor. On one occasion, Commodus's violent threats reached the point of absurdity, as one of the senators present related. Having killed an ostrich and cut off his head, Commodus came up to where we were sitting, holding the head in his left hand, and in his right hand raising aloft his bloody sword. And though he spoke not a word, yet he wagged his head with a grin, indicating that he would treat us in the same way. We can imagine the absurd scene of a madman holding up a bloody severed ostrich head and looking at us menacingly. All of the Renaissance poetry about Cesare Borgia that celebrates his violent prowess in the arena in classical terms risks likening him to Commodus and the tyrannical Roman emperors. Spectacles in Rome during the Borgia papacy not only revived the magnificent grandeur and events of the Colosseum, but also its deadly violence. The Roman Games were also revived in 15th century Florence. Although the city was mostly run by the Medici family, in name and political culture, it was a republic. In Rome, the popes, like the Roman emperors, sponsored festivities. In Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, the Medici family made serious attempts to resurrect the ancient games, especially large-scale hunting spectacles. If papal Rome embraced bullfights, lions were center stage in Florence. The great protector and symbol of Florence was the marzocco. Images of the grand lion were all over the city. Actual lions, in fact, were kept in central Florence since at least 1285. They were often gifts from other cities or princes, including Venice and the Pope. Here you can see the seraglio that imported in. This is Piazza di San Marco. San Marco, the Dominican friary. And yeah, right there is the stables. Just quite right, very close to downtown Florence. Lions were auspicious representations of Florence. The births of cubs were seen as good omens. At the beginning of the 15th century, Florence had 24 lions in captivity. 100 years later, Leonardo da Vinci said 25 to 30. These lions became star performers in animal combat and hunting spectacles. Here we see conscious efforts to recreate the animal combats of ancient Rome. In 1459, for the visit of Pope Pius II in Galeazzo Maria Sforza, several hunting shows were put on in the Piazza della Signoria. The centerpiece of the show were the lions. As one poet at the time put it, the spectators were hoping that the lions would massacre the other animals. An anonymous poet describes the piazza filled with wolves, wild boar, crazed buffaloes, 2 unbridled horses, cattle, cows, and bulls. 12 cane corsi, or large dogs, mastiffs, did the first assault on the animals. Then 4 lions were released. The grand lions proudly saunter out into the piazza, and all the other animals tremble. With one great high and light leap, a lion falls upon a horse, showing his command over the beast with his teeth firmly at his back. But the great wounded horse bucks all around. The lion's mouth splits open the back and tears out a piece of flesh and leaves a large gash in the horse's body. This is fun poetry. Unfortunately, after this initial bloody excitement, the lions noticed the large audience and retreated, allowing the other animals to roam freely. The angry yells of the disappointed spectators, we are told, only terrified the lions more. Come on, go get them. The guest of honor, Pope Pius II, later complained about the Florentine extravagance. The Florentines put on a combat between lions and horses and other animals, and a tournament. But the amount of wine drunk at these events was much greater than the blood spilled. What's the deal? Lions, it seems, were fickle performers in antiquity as well, and Renaissance writers surely drew on Martial. The Roman poet describes the embarrassing episode in the Colosseum, when instead of attacking rabbits, savage lions played with the little furry beasts, caressing them and letting them slip through their open mouths. It's a great poem. Yeah. Martial spins the lack of blood into praise for the emperor's clemency. They have not been taught this clemency, but the lions know whom they serve. Here's Caesar. Likewise, in 1459, to quell the public's disappointment at the lack of gore, poets and others interpreted the lion's refusal to fight as a divine sign. Like the gentle lions, Florence herself was peace-loving, gentle like a lamb. There is, of course, a big contrast between the ancient and the Renaissance interpretation of the lion's refusal to kill. In 1459, poets likened the gentle lions to Florence, powerful, strong, but peace-loving and kind to allies. Under the Florentine Republic, lions are independent noble beasts, making their own choices and obeying no one. The Roman poet Martial focuses on the lion's obedience to their emperor, Domitian. Lions know their master. In both, however, violent spectacle is celebrated, and a lack of blood sport is a public embarrassment and needs explanation. The trend towards classical magnificence reached its apogee in high Renaissance Rome under Pope Julius II. Writers praised Julius as a new Augustus for rebuilding Rome in classical grandeur. Like his namesake, Julius Caesar, the Pope actually led troops into battle. Julius started plans for the new St. Peter's Basilica, the biggest, most magnificent church that had ever been planned. This church consciously competed with ancient basilicas and domes. Julius also started building the immense space next to St. Peter's called the Cortile del Belvedere. See here, there's the plan for St. Peter's. There's a kind of Vatican palace where the popes and people live. Well, just the popes. Yeah. And here's the Cortile del Belvedere, this whole area we started building. A document from 1505 says that the area was being leveled for a bullfight in 1505. Vasari and other contemporaries talk about the construction of a teatro, a theater for tournaments and games. You can see it was originally one long, incredibly long, open area. It's almost like the Circus Maximus or something like that, this place. But later on, 100 years, well, under, what, Sixtus V, they cut it in half. And this is, if you worked in the Vatican Library, these are the main rooms of the Vatican Library. Right? You come in over here. Now it's a parking lot. You come in over here, and you go up. Yeah, the Vatican Library is here, and the Vatican Archives are over there. But, yeah, it's a great place to work. But here's the back, the Belvedere place. And if you've gone to Rome and gone on the, been to the Vatican museums, you can go in this area over here, and there's a giant pine cone. And anyway, it's fun. Well, I love the pine cone because the medieval legend is it came out of the top of the Pantheon, right? It just shot up and it was turned into a church. So they got rid of all the pagan gods and then it shot up and landed in the Vatican. In antiquity, as Flavio Biondo and others emphasized, the Vatican Hill had been the site of violent games, chariot racing, and even full-scale sea battles on an artificial lake. You can see this is this wonderful fresco in Castel Sant'Angelo from the sort of 1550s, but it shows the Belvedere back there, but it also shows this ancient Naumachia, right, the sea battle here. And if you get close, you can see the two boats kind of sinking each other, so it's kind of fun. But, yeah. The Catholic Church had always boasted its foundation on the blood of its martyrs. The Basilica of St. Peter's was built on top of the spine of Nero's circus, where St. Peter, the first pope, was crucified upside down. His bones are still there. Yet, attached to the Basilica, Pope Julius built a magnificent venue for holding the same kinds of spectacles of imperial Rome. He specifically commissioned his architect, Bramante, to design the Cortile del Belvedere in imitation of the ancient Roman hippodromes, the Circus Maximus, and the imperial stadium that lay in ruins on the Palatine Hill. In addition to theater and sport, the Belvedere showcased Julius's growing collection of ancient sculptures, several of athletes. You can see this is a fun drawing. It shows the Laocoon, which was unearthed in, 1506 or so, the Apollo Belvedere, these great naked statues which were on display in Cortile del Belvedere. And his successor, Pope Leo X, kept his menagerie of exotic animals, including his beloved elephant, Hanno, on public display there. People could visit it on Sundays. Throughout the 16th century, magnificent tournaments were held in the Cortile del Belvedere. In fact, the fact that the highest representatives of the Catholic Church, the popes, built such a massive structure dedicated to violent sport and spectacle shows how accepted the Roman games and the legacy of classical violent entertainment had become by the High Renaissance. There was little of the tension and conflicts over pagan spectacles that so upset the early Christian writers and disgusted Petrarch. What would Augustine or Petrarch have said about this? The Renaissance reception of violent Roman entertainments was thus mixed. There were critics of the Roman games, including Petrarch and Flavio Biondo, but also enthusiastic recreations. The popes, no less, and the cardinals of the Catholic Church hosted violent games that recalled the gory and fatal excitement of gladiator battles and hunts in the Colosseum. The Renaissance shared with ancient Rome the same disturbing fascination with real violence. The most beautiful part of the game was when a bull gored a man to death, or 8 soldiers died in a siege performance. Such violence was classical, but even more exalted, since knights and freemen were killed rather than the slave gladiators of antiquity. Poets praised the slaughter of bulls, leopards chasing and mauling goats, and a lion tearing apart a horse. When lions failed to perform, even the Pope complained about the lack of violence. Oops. And there you have it.
Fascinating talk, wonderful images.
Okay, so I'm thinking about, in our class, we talked about sort of the role and import of exotic animals in Renaissance Italy, and how often caretakers from their respective regions were there to care for these animals, ensure that they were able to breed, be healthy, etc. And I'm presuming that attached to lions. And I guess I'm wondering, for the sort of performative masculinity that comes with the cavalleresca class, or the knightly classes that are engaging with bulls, if their virtue is reliant on this success of their masculinity, is dependent on sort of this slaughter, how healthy are the bulls? Because they're not exotic. And I guess I'm wondering, you're talking about theatrics, how, if you can speak to it, sort of the, how theatrically prepared is it? Or is it a full-on, these bulls are healthy and ready to go? Because if royalties coming in, that's kind of where I'm wondering.
Well, okay, bulls, you're thinking about Rome probably, and Cesare Borgia, and the poet, the Borgia poet Cantalicio, specifically says that these are amazing bulls, they're ferocious, they're from Spain, so they're more ferocious than the Italian kind. That some of the other sources, the documentary sources, do talk about these ferocious bulls. I don't know. I haven't found anything about handlers, but I can look into that. I mean, there were bullfights from antiquity on, medieval Italy and stuff down there. It was still going on, as witnessed in the Colosseum, right, of 1332. They had a big bullfight there. But as far what I'm thinking about is the sources talk about the specifically kind of Spanish versus Italian way of bullfighting, and the images I've seen from early on, the Italian ones seem to be guys on horses for the most part, with long lances, the statue things. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean the other thing is this is a live performance, so yeah, people are killed and all this, so yeah, in terms of preparation, I don't know, maybe they, I don't know, maybe it worked though.
Tony, can you talk about the audience in the Renaissance world? Because it's obviously, there are the elite, the Pope and courtiers, but do we actually get a mixing going on? What do we know about the audience of these folks?
Totally, but they're all different audiences, I'm thinking, right? In Naples, I mean, Petrarch makes a big deal about the audience and how there's all these noblemen there, but because his point is that these are, supposed to be the best people in society, and they're so excited about this guy dying. This is ridiculous. So you have a mixture, but he also talks about the kind of rabble. So you had, I mean, their bleachers were set up in Piazza dei Signoria as well, and they sold tickets, but then there were all these different areas where people could come. But yeah, the spectators are key as well. And and then for in 1473 for Eleanor of Aragon's the sort of wedding banquet, that was limited, right? Because it was a big banquet and things, so a different kind of audience. But that's one of the things I'm curious about is this, because Augustine and Seneca and the other ancients make a big deal about what violence does to the person, right? The soul, the person watching, the spectator. And Petrarch picks up on this to a certain extent, but he also talks about the death of the nobleman, right? So it's a different kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm making too much of that distinction, right? The spectator or there's the sadistic pleasure of watching someone die, but then there's the the guy dying, right? It's not the, or getting tortured, right? There's two sides to that. So yeah, no, that's a great question. It's interesting. But they do talk about the spectators, like the guy in Rome, the bullfight for 1332. The chronicler we have specifically talks about the matrons of Rome, Francesca da Roma, all these different names. And in fact, one poor girl was getting into her seat in the Colosseum. She tripped and fell, and she sprained her ankle. Anyway, I mean, she was a young woman, I don't know, like 16 or something. But it's just funny the chronicler mentions this, and everybody grabbed her and picked her up and put her in her seat to make sure she didn't miss the event. Where either her brother, her lover, or somebody got killed, right? 18 young guys got killed in that, right? And 9 fools. Yeah. No, so it's interesting that there is that tension is something I've been thinking about a lot for the book, right? The whole Petrarch Augustan dialogue there is kind of starting out violent. Because otherwise, I mean, there's loads of these descriptions of bullfights and things, but what do you do with it as a historian? You're like, oh great, yeah, all right, they killed some fools, everybody loved it. But yeah, so I don't know, these other issues are interesting for the audience and stuff. Thank you.
So, since as far as I know, there currently aren't violent games in modern day Rome, when did this stop? Do you have a sense yet of whether this was particular to the Renaissance? Or?
Right. Well, all right, yeah, Rome's a little different, right? If you're talking about Florence, you have Calcio Storico, right, which starts in kind of the 15th, early 16th century. It's an incredibly violent form of football, kind of rugby, that still goes on today. So that's still going on. At various times, they've stopped that. In Rome, carnival celebrations are more theatrical, especially now and stuff, than they were before. I mean, they do crazy stuff to Jews, right? During Carnival and Easter and stuff, so that was part of the spectacle. And yeah, so when did it stop? Yeah, it depends. I mean, the bulls were big for the bourgeois because that was their sign as well, so they picked up on that. But it was also part of the Roman Carnival. And yeah, that's a great question. I don't know when they stopped doing bullfights on Testaccio. I think I've seen prints from the 17th century that still show them going on.
Tony, was there a turn away from some of this with the Catholic Reformation, starting with the Council of Trent, or were the tones basically the same from when you get into Tridentine Catholicism?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, the High Renaissance is basically Julius II and Leo X. And then, I mean, I know there's Clement VII and stuff, but Rome gets sacked in 1527. Everybody goes away, all the humanists, and it's pretty depressing. And then, you get the kind of reform Rome and stuff, things are going on. And some of the popes, like Sixtus V is a guy who put that big thing in for the library. He kind of cut down the Cortile de Belvedere. But I want to emphasize that Julius II started building the Cortile de Belvedere, but he didn't finish it. It got finished much later. And in fact, you have that amazing tournament in, 1565, right there. And that was extremely, violent. 2 people died in that one, and there's big descriptions. So, yeah, and popes go back and forth. I mean, Adrian VI tried to fill it in too. So yeah, reform certainly changed it, but it also made it more performative. In a sense, you have the courtier, you've got this kind of, we're getting more into the early modern stage of dueling and things like that are taking over in terms of violence, right? People are working their way out in a more organized way. But I mean, violent sport is still there. Played forms of football, stone throwing was big in Italian cities in the Middle Ages. Preachers are always saying, stop throwing stones at each other. but yeah, no, the Reformation definitely made a difference, but it depends. Different popes back and forth. Pius V in the late 16th century was extremely pious, but then you got other popes who are more open to these kinds of things. But yeah, no, it's a serious, it's a great question. I'll probably stop before I get to that.
With the advent of the Italian War, do you see an explosive response in civic rituals to the sporting Britain in the 15th and 16th century?
You mean like the French invasion of 1494 and everything like that? Is there an explosion? You mean
or an explosive response, let's say. You have a Jesuit portrait.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you get more of these kind of violent tournaments are happening, right? Because then there are stories of warriors going out and challenging people one-on-one, and then these things, and that's part of the origin story. The myth story of Culture Storico in Florence is during the siege of Florence in 1530. The Florentines were, the Habsburg troops were outside trying to besiege them, and they were totally outnumbered and all this, but what do the Florentines do? Within sight of all the invaders, they have an incredibly violent game of rugby football, right? And that's the origin story. So yeah, so there's spectacle, but violence continues, and then, yeah, there's form, yeah. Definitely, no, there's all these connections with things going on. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for that great presentation. As someone who's not very familiar with this history, I was just wondering how much was the idea of the spectacle of violence associated with biblical and Vatican conceptions of anthropomorphism, because you talked about humans killing humans, animals killing animals, humans killing animals, so forth. So I'm just wondering how much of it was an ideological project of institutionalizing the anthropomorphism of a particular kind of man.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, okay. Yeah, there's two. I mean, I see your question in two parts. First of all, the animals in these anthropomorphic. Yeah, there's some sense in antiquity, right? We got Cicero talks about I'm sorry, Pompey's theater in 55 BC. There's a excuse me. There's a elephant hunt. They're killing all these elephants and they're whining like human beings. And Cicero talks about how horrible this is, and that they must be kind of rational. Everybody's crying with the elephants. They're crying. So there are these kind of snippets of anthropomorphizing animals, but it's never that extreme. And I mean, yeah, the lions they're the protectors, we look up to them. So yeah, that stuff is there, certainly. But in terms of masculinity, especially with Cesare Borgia, I mean, it's incredibly pronounced, one-on-one against the bull. And yeah, so I mean, that ideal is totally there. And the spectacle, like the performance of masculinity is there. But yeah, no, that's a good question. It's interesting.
I think Pliny the Elder talks about gladiators' blood being used as a cure for epilepsy. Is there a parallel for that, or like some kind of mechanistic healing power for the gladiator's body in the Renaissance?
Yeah, no, that's wow, that's interesting. I'm trying to remember what Pliny was saying. Well, I mean, Livy talks about it, Cicero, about how the importance, especially Livy, about how gladiators, they both accustom people to violence, to seeing the gore, right, when a gladiator gets his arm cut off, or something like that, so that when you're in the battlefield, you're not going to kind of balk at that, because you're used to the violence in that sense. So yeah, there's the spectators again, but also, I mean, the origins of gladiator combat, as far as we know, are a funereal thing, where you want to get like the blood for the Etruscan and Roman civilization, for the people. They start having these gladiator fights for dead relatives and things, and the blood is supposed to propitiate the gods, the infernal gods. So, I mean, I don't know, in terms of health, I don't know if that goes to where you're going, or you're thinking of something else. In terms of a cure of epilepsy, is it cure that you're seeing, this violence, and it's shocking you out of your epilepsy?
No, they sell vials of gladiator blood.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Oh. Where did Pliny say that? Okay. Thank you.
The source to check it.
Yeah.
I've got a epistemological question. Things like Cesare Borgia, going out and living and killing the bull or whatever, do you have enough voices from enough different people to have any sense that this actually really happened? Or is it more sort of a particular propagandistic line of hagiography coming from?
Yeah, there's a total line of hagiography, but there are documentary sources, chroniclers that, on other things at least, they're fairly, obviously they're not effusive as the Borgia poet who's turning this into big scales, but then there are, we have ambassador reports, the Venetian ambassador, Adriano Prosperi, Bernardino Prosperi, it doesn't matter, but we've got some ambassador accounts where they're writing descriptions back home, so they don't really have a reason to exaggerate like this. But part of what I'm studying is is the rhetoric of it and the exaggeration, both for masculinity, for politics, for how they're twisting it, how they're using the ancient poetry and the ancient texts, but adapting them to I don't know, Christian people world or something. But yeah, no, we do have, for some of them, others we don't have other sources. But yeah, and then like the Meat Mountain thing, there are two poets are the richest, but there are several eyewitness people. In fact, Eleanor herself writes this incredible effusive description of all the stuff she saw to her father. Right? She goes, oh, look at this, amazing what they did. But yeah, no, that's a serious problem. Whether or not it really happened, I don't know, but that's not the question I'm. Yeah. Okay.
I have so many questions. It's fascinating material. I'll limit to one, which is just, do you think that there's a difference? You put the two together, sport and spectacle, because obviously there are spectators for some of these tournaments, for various of the games, different kinds of occasions, have different audiences. I'm wondering if there's a difference at all between sport and spectacle, in the sense that there is some ideal developing at all about the participation and participants in it, regardless of, the kind of civic display and what that might do. So I'm wondering, there's much interest in it as sport, right, as opposed to spectacle.
No, it's a fantastic question, and that's one of the, even in ancient history, right, they're always trying to, people argue that it wasn't sport, right, that this spectacle was violence or whatever.
It helps you train. And
Yeah. But, what was I going to say? But one of the big differences in the kind of later medieval Renaissance thing is that you have a lot of the performers are noblemen, right? So there is an athletic component. They're also having wrestling matches and things like that, but they don't really go on that much about them. There's a lot of races where they're running, and they use a lot of like Cantalicio has all these poems about the races they held in Rome, and then Canale in Ferrara, and they compared them to the Greek Olympics and all of this. So this, yeah, I mean, that's one thing I'm really interested in, especially in my last book, is this idea of athletic virtue and the importance of physical fitness. And yeah, in my last book, I talked a lot about this with Jared's reintroduction of a Greek kind of physical concept of virtue that you're working out, whether it's wrestling or running or even just walking, right? Some of the new educational systems really stress that you have to balance the two in this classicizing way. But yeah, no, that's the sport or spectacle and the violence, and at what point is there a cutoff? And I don't know. I mean, even today, the extremely violent, I don't know, there are rules in the most violent sports. So does that make them sports? No, that's a great question. I don't think I answered it well. Yes.
That's a question. Given us a great sort of discussion of the sort of moral questions that surround this, but the civic humanists in particular ever talk about this as a stage in the road of history, and really mark its decline. Institution is the increasing time of the problem.
That's again an excellent question, and the thing to remember is that Cicero talks in the Tusculan Disputations. He dedicates practically an entire book to the virtue of gladiators who accept death. And so there's this self-sacrifice aspect for people like early humanists, like Leonardo Bruni or someone will talk about Cicero and anyway, so there's a real focus on virtue. In terms of yeah, you're right. I mean, a civic humanist, for the most part, it's Republican Rome is the key, right? And then the empire comes in and everything goes downhill, and you have these corrupt emperors and things. And yeah, I mean, Flavio Biondo in his Decades talks about decline. And one of his examples of the decline, actually his big source for the Colosseum, is kind of annoying. It's one of these stupid kind of Renaissance humanist things, is he completely plagiarizes Cassiodorus' letter of the last hunt in the Colosseum from 525. So Cassiodorus is writing to Theodosius and describes in great detail the whole events going on. But and this is where he has his moral critique of it. This is the sign. But yeah, no, that's, yeah, again, a great question. And obviously the bad emperors, you have Commodus and Domitian are there for sure, for sure.
Any other questions? Okay, well,
thank you for the excellent presentation. So my question is, you mentioned at some point that, you know, 3 expensive horses died, which made me believe that the humans who died were like, meh, no.
Yeah, oh yeah, totally. Oh,
So
that's the interesting thing, the animal thing, actually.
It did matter, actually, like, for example, were there legal repercussions for that, for killing those people, or did they just not matter?
Well, all right, so the ones who died were in the, what was that, the siege or the bulls killed, well, I mean, I don't know, what are you going to do, sue a bull? Legal repercussions. But, yeah, no, they stress the important horses, right, are like money. They're expensive and fancy and want stably. Whereas, especially the people who got horn gouged to death, whatever, in the Borgia one were not, you know, they were his soldiers and things. So they were not totally nobles. They were more like mercenaries. So I don't think, you know, whereas the horses that died would have been, you know, more valuable. Totally more valuable. Yeah, so I guess in that sense they're expendable, but they're still, you know, kind of free men to a certain extent. But yeah.
well, blood will not flow, but wine and beer will flow after this. That's it. We'll have